Beijing, summer of 1916. The streets fill with mourners dressed in white, the traditional color of death in China, as an elaborate funeral procession winds through the capital. At its center lies Yuan Shikai, the man who had claimed to be China's indispensable leader, the only figure capable of holding the vast nation together. But even as priests chant Buddhist sutras and Confucian scholars perform ancient rites, something darker stirs in the assembled crowd. Military commanders in ornate uniforms stand at attention, their faces solemn, their eyes calculating. They're not mourning, they're measuring. They're watching each other, counting soldiers, assessing strengths and weaknesses. Within months, these men will turn their armies against one another in a struggle that will fracture China into more than 30 competing military fiefdoms, plunging the world's oldest continuous civilization into an era of chaos that would last nearly 4 decades. The question isn't just how this happened. The question is why the center of Chinese power, which had held for 2,000 years through dynasties and disasters, suddenly and catastrophically failed to hold it all. To understand how China nearly split apart, we need to first understand what held it together for so long. The Chinese imperial system wasn't just a form of government, it was a cosmic order, a philosophy made manifest in institutions. For millennia, the emperor ruled not by mere force, but by the mandate of heaven, a legitimizing principle that bound together vast territories, countless ethnic groups, and hundreds of millions of people under a single centralized authority. This wasn't democracy, but it was a kind of contract. The emperor provided order, justice, and prosperity. In return, the people offered obedience and taxes. When natural disasters struck or invasions succeeded, these weren't just political failures. They were signs that heaven had withdrawn its mandate, that the cosmic order itself had been disrupted. By the middle of the 19th century, that order was crumbling. The Qing Dynasty, ruled by Manchu emperors who had conquered China in 1644, faced challenges unlike any in Chinese history. Western powers, armed with industrial technology and imperial ambitions, forced their way into Chinese markets through a series of humiliating military defeats. The Opium Wars of the 1840s and 1850s revealed a terrible truth. China's traditional military forces were no match for modern European weaponry. The treaties that followed these defeats weren't just unfair. They were designed to be humiliating, to demonstrate China's subordinate position in a new global hierarchy that Chinese elites had never imagined could exist. But the real damage came from within. In 1850, a failed civil service candidate named Hung Shuquan, who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, launched a rebellion that would kill more than 20 million people over 14 years. The Taiping Rebellion, as it came to be known, nearly destroyed the Qing Dynasty entirely. Imperial armies couldn't suppress it. Instead, regional officials raised their own military forces, personal armies loyal not to the emperor but to the generals who commanded them. Men like Zingofan and Li Hongjiang built military machines financed by local taxes, equipped with modern weapons, purchased from foreign suppliers, and staffed by soldiers who owed their allegiance to individual commanders rather than to any abstract imperial authority. This was the original sin of the Warlord Era, though it wouldn't fully manifest for another 60 years. Once you allow military power to become regionalized, once you permit generals to control their own revenue streams and build their own armies, you create a structural problem that no amount of reform can easily reverse. The Qing Dynasty survived the Taiping Rebellion, but it survived fundamentally weakened. Power had decentralized. Authority had fragmented. The cosmic order had cracked, and no amount of imperial ritual could paper over the fissures. The late Qing reformers understood this. After the catastrophic defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, when Japan, a nation the Chinese had long considered their cultural inferior, destroyed China's modernized fleet and seized Taiwan, even the most conservative elements of the Qing court recognized that something had to change. The reforms that followed were sweeping in ambition: new schools teaching Western subjects, modern armies trained in European tactics, constitutional experiments borrowed from Japan and Europe, economic development projects designed to build railways and factories. On paper, China was modernizing rapidly. In reality, these reforms came too late and accomplished too little. The problem was psychological as much as structural. The Qing elite was paralyzed by contradictions. Reformers wanted to preserve China's cultural essence while adopting Western techniques, a balance that proved impossible to maintain. Conservatives feared that any change would lead to total collapse, so they resisted reforms that might have saved the system. Neither faction could act decisively. Both were trapped by the weight of history, by the knowledge that they were stewards of a civilization older than any European nation. Yet that civilization was being humiliated by countries it had once dismissed as barbarians. By 1911, the contradictions became unsustainable. A minor railway dispute in central China sparked uprisings across the country. Within months, province after province declared independence from Qing rule. The revolution succeeded not because the revolutionaries were particularly strong, but because the imperial system had become hollow. There was no reserve of loyalty to draw upon, no reservoir of legitimacy that could be tapped in a crisis. The Qing Dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, collapsed with surprising speed and minimal bloodshed. But the revolutionaries who celebrated in the streets of Shanghai and Wuhan had no idea what they were about to unleash. Into this power vacuum stepped Yuan Shikai, the indispensable man. Yuan was a military commander of considerable talent and even more considerable ambition. He had built one of the Qing dynasty's most effective modern armies, the Beiyang army, which was loyal not to the emperor but to Yuan personally. When the revolution broke out, both sides needed him. The Qing court needed his army to suppress the rebels. The revolutionaries needed him to betray the Qing and legitimize their cause. Yuan, with the calculating mind of a natural politician, played both sides. He negotiated the emperor's abdication in exchange for a generous settlement, then maneuvered himself into the presidency of the new Chinese Republic, sidelining Sun Yat-sen, the revolution's ideological leader, in the process. This was Yuan's Faustian bargain. He gained supreme power, but he gained it through betrayal and manipulation, not through any legitimate claim to authority. He wasn't an emperor blessed by heaven. He wasn't elected by the people. He was simply the man with the biggest army who had made the cleverest deals, and everyone knew it. The revolutionaries knew he had betrayed their cause. The old Qing loyalists knew he had betrayed the emperor. His own generals knew that if Yuan could betray everyone else, he could betray them too. For a few years, Yuan held China together through force of personality and military strength, but he made a catastrophic mistake. In 1915, convinced that only monarchical rule could truly unify China, he attempted to declare himself emperor. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Provincial military governors who had nominally submitted to his authority rebelled. Foreign powers, who had grudgingly accepted Yuan as a stabilizing force, withdrew their support. Even Yuan's own generals began to distance themselves. The monarchy attempt lasted only 83 days before Yuan was forced to abandon it. The humiliation destroyed him. Within a year, he was dead, likely from uremia, though some whispered that the shame had killed him as surely as any disease. Yuan Shikai's death in June 1916 marks the true beginning of the Warlord Era. His funeral procession, elaborate and imperial in its pretensions, was the last moment when any single figure could claim to represent all of China. After the mourning period ended, the generals who had served under Yuan, who had built their own armies and established their own regional power bases, looked around and realized that there was no authority above them anymore. Beijing still existed as a capital, and whoever controlled it could claim to represent the legitimate government of China. But this was a legal fiction. Real power had devolved to men with guns and the willingness to use them. The warlord ecosystem that emerged was complex and constantly shifting. 3 major cliques came to dominate: the Jili clique, led by Feng Guozheng, and later Wu Peifu, which controlled the area around Beijing and claimed the mantle of legitimate government. The Fengshan clique, led by Zhang Zuolin, which dominated Manchuria and its valuable industrial resources. And the Anhui clique, led by Duan Qirui, which controlled parts of eastern China and cultivated close ties with Japan. Beyond these major factions were dozens of minor warlords, each controlling a province, or even just a few counties, each maintaining armies that ranged from a few thousand to several 100,000 men. What sustained this system? How did warlords finance their armies and maintain their power? The answer reveals the fundamentally extractive nature of warlord economics. First and most important was control of railways. In early 20th century China, railways were the arteries of commerce and military movement. Whoever controlled the major rail lines could tax goods moving through their territory, and could rapidly deploy troops to suppress challenges. Railway stations became fortified positions. Railway workers became crucial intelligence assets. Entire wars were fought over control of key junctions. Second was opium. Despite China's catastrophic experience with opium addiction in the 19th century, despite international agreements to suppress the trade, opium became the primary revenue source for most warlords. The logic was brutally simple. Opium was compact, valuable, and produced massive tax revenues. Farmers could be forced or incentivized to grow poppies instead of food crops. Opium dens could be licensed and taxed. Addiction created a captive market that generated reliable income. The human cost was immense. Millions of Chinese became addicts. Agricultural production declined. Social fabric deteriorated, but warlords weren't building for the future. They were extracting wealth to sustain military power in the present. Third were foreign loans. European powers, Japan, and even the United States extended credit to various warlord factions, taking Chinese customs houses and salt taxes as collateral. This created a perverse dynamic. Foreign powers had financial incentives to keep China fragmented, because a unified China might repudiate the unequal treaties and reclaim control of its own revenues. Loans were secured by specific revenue streams, which meant that foreign powers directly controlled portions of the Chinese economy. Shanghai, with its foreign concessions, became a peculiar hybrid, technically Chinese territory, but effectively governed by international committees that operated outside Chinese law. But economics alone doesn't explain warlord power. The social psychology of warlordism was equally important. These were patron-client networks built on personal loyalty and mutual benefit. A successful warlord needed to distribute enough spoils to keep his officers loyal, enough salaries to keep his soldiers fed, enough opportunities for advancement to keep ambitious subordinates hopeful rather than rebellious. This wasn't ideological loyalty. This was transactional. A general served his warlord because serving paid better than rebellion, till it didn't. Defections, betrayals, and sudden alliance shifts were constant features of warlord politics. Take Zhang Zuolin as a case study. Zhang began his career as a bandit in Manchuria, a mounted outlaw who raided villages and attacked government convoys. He was captured and given a choice: execution or service in the imperial army fighting other bandits. Zhang chose service and proved remarkably effective, rising through the ranks not because of education or family connections. He was illiterate until his 20s, but through military talent and ruthless pragmatism. When the Qing Dynasty fell, Zhang positioned himself as the dominant military force in Manchuria. He cultivated relationships with Japan, which had extensive economic interests in the region, while maintaining enough independence to be seen as a Chinese nationalist rather than a foreign puppet. By the 1920s, Zhang controlled one of China's most industrialized regions, commanded armies equipped with modern weapons, including aircraft and armored trains, and had transformed himself from bandit to would-be king. Zhang's success illustrates a paradox of the warlord era. These men adopted modern military technology while maintaining fundamentally medieval social structures. They had machine guns and artillery, but their armies operated on personal loyalty networks that would have been familiar to feudal lords centuries earlier. They established arsenals and military academies, but used them to pursue regional power rather than national development. They were simultaneously modernizers and reactionaries, trapped between two eras, fully belonging to neither. Beijing, during this period, became something surreal, a capital without a country. Whoever controlled the city could claim to be China's legitimate government, could issue proclamations and sign treaties, could appoint officials and create ministries. Foreign diplomats maintained embassies there and recognized successive governments as if they actually governed. But everyone understood the reality. The Beijing government controlled, at most, a few surrounding provinces. Its writ didn't extend to Manchuria or Canton or Sichuan. It couldn't collect taxes for most of China. It couldn't enforce laws beyond the capital's immediate vicinity. Beijing was a stage set, an elaborate performance of sovereignty for an international audience that played along because the alternative, acknowledging that China had no functional central government, was too diplomatically uncomfortable. This situation had precedents in world history. When the Roman Empire collapsed in Western Europe, power fragmented into countless local authorities, dukes, counts, bishops, claiming legitimacy while exercising practical control over limited territories. The difference was timescale. European fragmentation lasted for centuries. China's warlord period lasted decades. This compression created a unique intensity. Changes that might have taken generations in medieval Europe happened in years in early 20th century China. Alliances formed and dissolved with dizzying speed. Battles were fought with modern weapons over ancient grievances. Traditional Confucian scholars served warlord courts that operated according to pure power politics. The foreign concessions in cities like Shanghai and Tianjin added another layer of complexity. These were zones of extraterritoriality where foreign laws applied, where Chinese police had no authority, where foreign troops maintained order. They became safe havens for anyone fleeing warlord violence: revolutionaries, intellectuals, criminals, business people. They were also economic powerhouses. Shanghai's foreign concessions contained China's most advanced industries, its most sophisticated financial institutions, its most cosmopolitan culture. The paradox was painful. The freest, most prosperous parts of China were the parts not under Chinese control. Chinese nationalists could see what their country might become: modern, wealthy, orderly, but only by surrendering sovereignty to foreign powers. This contradiction fueled the May 4th movement of 1919, when students and intellectuals took to the streets to protest China's humiliation at the Versailles Peace Conference. China had sent laborers to support the Allied effort. In World War I, Chinese diplomats expected that loyalty to be rewarded with the return of German concessions in Shandong province. Instead, the Western powers transferred those concessions to Japan. The betrayal was devastating. It revealed that China's weakness meant its interests would always be sacrificed to great power politics. The protesters demanded not just the return of Shandong, but a fundamental transformation of Chinese society and culture. They blamed Confucianism, traditional learning, and old social structures for China's weakness. They called for science, democracy, and cultural revolution. But their protests couldn't change the fundamental reality. As long as China remained fragmented under warlord rule, it would remain weak, exploited, and humiliated on the world stage. Yet chaos, as always, creates opportunities for those with vision. The warlord era's instability opened spaces for radical political movements that wouldn't have been possible under a strong central government. Into this vacuum stepped both foreign powers seeking to expand their influence and domestic revolutionaries seeking to remake China entirely. Japan's approach was incremental but relentless. The 21 demands of 1915 represented Tokyo's attempt to essentially reduce China to a Japanese protectorate. The demands included Japanese control over Shandong, expanded rights in Manchuria and Mongolia, Japanese advisors in the Chinese government, and joint Japanese-Chinese control of Chinese police forces. Yuan Shikai, desperate for Japanese support for his imperial ambitions, accepted most of the demands in secret negotiations. When the details leaked, the public outcry was overwhelming. But Japan didn't need full acceptance. Each concession, each loan, each treaty created new facts on the ground. Japanese influence expanded, regardless of Chinese objections. Manchuria became Japan's laboratory for colonial control. The South Manchurian Railway Company wasn't just a transportation business. It was a state within a state, controlling railways, mines, factories, and eventually entire cities. Japanese settlers moved into Manchuria by the hundreds of thousands. Japanese troops, ostensibly protecting the railway, established military bases throughout the region. Zhang Zuolin, the dominant warlord, accepted Japanese support because it helped him maintain power, but he was increasingly trapped. Every Japanese loan came with conditions. Every Japanese advisor reported to Tokyo. By the late 1920s, Manchuria was nominally under Chinese control, but effectively a Japanese sphere of influence. Why did Western powers allow this? The question reveals the moral bankruptcy of great power politics in the early 20th century. Woodrow Wilson came to Versailles preaching self-determination, but when it came to China, Western interests aligned with Japanese expansion. Britain had a formal alliance with Japan and extensive economic interests in China that it wanted to protect. France was focused on European recovery. The United States talked about the open door policy and Chinese territorial integrity, but wasn't willing to confront Japan militarily to enforce these principles. So at Versailles, Wilson's idealism collided with realpolitik, and realpolitik won. China's pleas were ignored, Japan's claims were endorsed. The message was clear: weak nations have no rights that strong nations are bound to respect. But if Japan represented foreign predation, Sun Yat-sen and the emerging communist movement represented domestic revolution. Sun had been the ideological father of the 1911 revolution, but he'd been quickly sidelined by Yuan Shikai. Why? By the early 1920s, Sun was in Canton, leading a government that claimed to represent all of China, but actually controlled only a few southern provinces. Sun's vision was republican, nationalist, and modernizing, but it kept colliding with the reality of warlord power. He preached democracy and national unity while depending on unreliable warlord allies who betrayed him repeatedly. The Chinese Civil War that followed was in many ways the final settling of accounts from the warlord era. The communists won not just through military superiority, though their strategy was often brilliant, but because they offered something the nationalists couldn't: a vision of fundamental social transformation that addressed the problems that had plagued China since the Qing collapse. Where warlords had extracted wealth through opium taxes and foreign loans, the communists implemented land reform that gave peasants ownership of the land they worked. Where warlord armies had been held together by pay and plunder, communist forces were indoctrinated with revolutionary ideology that created genuine commitment. Where the nationalist government had compromised with former warlords and maintained regional power structures, the communists insisted on centralized command and uniform administration. When Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China in October 1949, he explicitly framed it as the end of the century of humiliation that had begun with the Opium Wars. China was unified. Foreign concessions were abolished. Foreign troops were expelled. China would never again be weak, divided, or vulnerable to external predation. The cost of this unity was totalitarian control, ideological conformity, and decades of political campaigns that would claim millions of lives. But from the communist perspective, this was preferable to the chaos and humiliation of the warlord era. The Soviet Union's experience offers instructive parallels. Russia's civil war from 1918 to 1921 saw the country fragment into multiple competing factions: Reds, Greens, nationalist movements, warlords, and foreign interventionists. The Bolsheviks won by building a centralized party structure, a disciplined Red Army, and a ruthless willingness to use terror to enforce control. The Soviet state that emerged was authoritarian and brutal, but it was unified and strong. Chinese communists studied this model carefully and adapted it to Chinese conditions. Post-World War II decolonization reveals a different pattern. When European empires collapsed in Africa and the Middle East, many newly independent nations struggled with the same problems that plagued warlord-era China: fragmented authority, competing power centers, military forces loyal to individuals rather than states' economies based on extraction rather than development. Countries like Congo, Nigeria, and Somalia experienced their own versions of warlordism, though under different names. The solutions varied. Some countries achieved stability through authoritarian rule, others through federal systems. Some remain fragmented to this day. This raises counterfactual questions about China's path. What if Yuan Shikai had succeeded in establishing a constitutional monarchy? It's impossible to know, but consider. Yuan had military power, administrative experience, and at least nominal legitimacy. If he had avoided the hubris of proclaiming himself emperor, if he had built genuine institutions rather than personal power, might he have created a stable transition from empire to modern state? Possibly, though the forces working against centralized authoritarianism, foreign interference, economic collapse were formidable. What if the nationalists had maintained their alliance with the communists? This seems more plausible in the short term. If Chiang hadn't massacred his communist allies in 1927, the revolutionary movement might have remained united through the Northern Expedition and beyond. But the ideological differences were fundamental. Communists wanted social revolutionland redistribution, class struggle, proletarian dictatorship. Nationalists wanted national unity under elite leadership. These visions were ultimately incompatible. The alliance would likely have fractured eventually, though perhaps under different circumstances. Could federalism have worked? China had experimented with provincial autonomy during the warlord era, and it had produced chaos. But other large, diverse countries, the United States, Switzerland, Germany, had made federalism work. A Chinese federation might have balanced central coordination with regional diversity. The problem was that Chinese political culture had 2,000 years of centralized imperial tradition. The mandate of heaven didn't permit divided sovereignty. Chinese intellectuals and politicians across the political spectrum, nationalists, communists, even some warlords all believed that China should be unified under a single authority. The question was never whether China should be unified, but who should unify it and how. These questions aren't merely academic. They illuminate the choices that created modern China. The Chinese Communist Party's obsession with unity, its fear of separatism, its hostility to regional autonomy, all of these stem directly from the Warlord Era's lessons. Hong Kong's protests, Xinjiang's repression, Taiwan's contested status, these are all ghosts of the fragmentation that nearly destroyed China in the 20th century. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure and investment program across Asia and Africa, can be understood partly as an anti-fragmentation strategy, binding regions together through economic interdependence in ways that make separatism economically irrational. Contemporary Chinese politics cannot be understood without reference to this history. When Chinese leaders invoke the century of humiliation, they're not being merely rhetorical. They're referring to a genuine historical trauma that shaped the nation's political consciousness. The memory of warlord chaos, of foreign exploitation, of national weakness and division. This isn't ancient history in China. It's living memory, passed down through families, taught in schools, referenced constantly in political discourse. Return to that funeral procession in Beijing, summer of 1916. Yuan Shikai's corpse, dressed in imperial robes he never had the right to wear, carried through streets lined with soldiers who had no loyalty except to power. That image captures the fundamental crisis of the Warlord Era, the complete collapse of legitimate authority, the reduction of politics to pure power struggle. From that collapse came decades of warfare, foreign invasion, social revolution, and civil war. The solution that eventually emerged, communist totalitarianism, was in many ways a reaction to that chaos, an attempt to ensure it could never happen again. The Warlord Era was China's crucible. It was the fire in which modern China was forged. Every major political force in 20th century China, nationalists, communists, even Japanese imperialists, defined themselves in opposition to warlordism. They all promised unity, strength, and national dignity to replace fragmentation, weakness, and humiliation. The tragedy is that the pursuit of these goals produced new forms of suffering even as it ended old ones. There's a pattern in human behavior that emerges clearly from this history. When faced with chaos, people will tolerate tyranny. When the alternative is anarchy or violence, economic collapse, social disintegration, centralized authoritarian control starts to look appealing. Thomas Hobbes understood this in 17th century England. The Leviathan, that all-powerful sovereign, exists to save us from the war of all against all. Chinese people in 1949 chose the Leviathan because they had experienced the alternative. They had lived through warlordism. They knew what happened when the center could not hold. Economically, the Warlord Era demonstrates a crucial truth. Fragmentation destroys development. Warlords extracted wealth but didn't build. They taxed commerce but didn't invest in infrastructure. They maintained armies but didn't educate populations. They thought in terms of months and years, not generations and centuries. The contrast with developmental states like Meiji Japan or Park Chung-hee's South Korea is striking. Those regimes were authoritarian, even brutal, but they channeled resources toward industrialization and education. They built. Warlords merely consumed. Geopolitically, the Warlord Era confirms that great power vacuums don't stay empty. When central authority collapsed in China, foreign powers and domestic revolutionaries rushed to fill the void. Japan seized Manchuria. The Soviets backed revolutionary movements. Western powers carved out spheres of influence. This pattern repeats throughout history. When strong states weaken, neighboring powers expand. The post-Soviet space saw Russian reassertion. The post-American Middle East sees regional powers competing for influence. Nature abhors a vacuum. So does geopolitics. The question that haunts this history is whether the cure was worse than the disease. Did China need totalitarian control to escape warlord fragmentation? Could a more pluralistic, democratic, federal China have emerged from the chaos? We can't know. History happened one way. The counterfactuals remain speculation. But the question matters because it forces us to consider trade-offs that every society faces between order and freedom, between unity and diversity, between stability and innovation. China's century of humiliation began with internal collapse, the Qing Dynasty's weaknesses, the 1911 revolutions, incompleteness, Yuan Shikai's failures, the Warlord Era's chaos. These created the conditions for foreign exploitation and eventual totalitarian solution. The current Chinese regime, with its surveillance state and political repression, its economic dynamism and nationalist assertiveness, is determined never to repeat those mistakes. Whether what they've built is sustainable, whether the Chinese people will indefinitely accept authoritarian control in exchange for prosperity and national dignity, whether the memory of chaos will forever justify the suppression of dissent. These are questions for the future, not the past. But the shadow of the Warlord Era, the memory of what happens when China fragments, remains a powerful force in Chinese political consciousness. It shapes how Chinese leaders think about governance, how Chinese people think about their relationship to the state, how China engages with the world. The Warlord Era ended decades ago, but its legacy endures, a reminder that the center must hold, whatever the cost of holding it. The solution came from an unexpected source, the Soviet Union. Lenin's government, seeking to spread communist revolution and counter Western imperialism, saw China's chaos as an opportunity. Soviet advisors arrived in Canton in 1923, bringing with them a revolutionary model based on Leninist organizational principles. Instead of trying to build a mass democracy in a fragmented country, the Soviets proposed building a disciplined revolutionary party with a dedicated military force. The Whampoa Military Academy, established near Canton with Soviet support, would train officers loyal not to individual commanders but to the revolutionary cause itself. This was the crucial innovation that would eventually end the Warlord Era. Traditional Chinese armies were built on personal loyalty to commanders. Warlord armies were mercenary forces held together by pay and patronage. But the National Revolutionary Army, being forged at Whampoa, was different. Its officers were indoctrinated in nationalism and revolutionary ideology. They were taught to see themselves as servants of the nation, not tools of individual leaders. This ideological foundation created a different kind of loyalty, one that could survive military defeats and leadership changes. The first united front between Sun's Nationalist Party and the newly formed Chinese Communist Party was a marriage of convenience brokered by Soviet advisors. The nationalists needed communist organizational skills and Soviet military aid. The communists needed nationalist legitimacy and resources. Both opposed warlordism and foreign imperialism. Strange bedfellows indeed, united by shared enemies rather than shared vision. Sun Yat-sen's death from cancer in 1925 might have derailed the revolutionary movement, but instead, it accelerated it. Leadership passed to Kai-shek, a Whampoa Military Academy commandant and talented military strategist who combined personal ambition with genuine nationalist fervor. Chiang understood what Sun sometimes didn't, that China wouldn't be unified through negotiations and political maneuvering. It would be unified through military conquest. The warlords had to be destroyed, not incorporated. The Northern Expedition of 1926 to 1928 was the culmination of years of preparation. The National Revolutionary Army marched north from Canton, defeating warlord forces one by one. The campaign was as much psychological as military. Nationalist propaganda depicted the expedition as a war of national liberation, freeing China from warlord oppression and foreign exploitation. Peasants and workers were mobilized to support the Revolutionary Army. Warlord forces, already demoralized and riddled with corruption, often disintegrated when confronted with an army that seemed to be fighting for something larger than personal gain. Wu Peifu, the scholarly warlord who had dominated central China, saw his armies collapse despite numerical superiority. His forces were better equipped and more numerous, but they were mercenaries fighting for pay. When faced with revolutionary forces fighting for national salvation, they simply melted away. Wu fled into exile, his power evaporating almost overnight. Zhang Zuolin, the old bandit turned Manchurian strongman, put up stiffer resistance. He had genuine regional support and Japanese backing. But even Zhang couldn't stop the revolutionary tide. In June 1928, as Zhang retreated to Manchuria by train, Japanese military officers detonated explosives beneath his railway car, killing him instantly. The assassination was meant to create an excuse for direct Japanese military intervention in Manchuria, but it backfired in the short term. Zheng's son, Zhang Zuolin, blamed the Japanese for his father's death and eventually joined the nationalist government, bringing Manchuria nominally under central control. By the end of 1928, the northern expedition had succeeded. Warlord armies had been defeated or absorbed. Beijing was under nationalist control, though the capital was moved to Nanjing. Foreign powers grudgingly recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government as China's legitimate authority. China appeared to be unified for the first time since Yuan Shikai's death, but this unification was largely illusory. On April 12, 1927, in the middle of the Northern Expedition's triumph, Chiang Kai-shek turned on his communist allies in what became known as the Shanghai Massacre. Nationalist troops and allied gang members rounded up communist organizers and labor leaders in Shanghai, executing thousands in a single night of terror. The purge spread to other cities under nationalist control. The First United Front collapsed in blood. Why did Chiang betray the alliance? The decision reflected multiple pressures and calculations. Shanghai's business elite and foreign commercial interests were terrified of communist-led labor movements that threatened property rights and foreign investments. They offered Chiang financial support in exchange for suppressing the communists. Chiang's own ideology was nationalist and anti-imperialist, but it was also fundamentally conservative. He feared social revolution more than he feared continued inequality. And strategically, Chiang calculated that foreign powers and Chinese elites would never accept communist participation in government. To gain their support for his regime, he had to demonstrate that he would protect their interests. The consequences of this decision would echo for decades. Communists who survived the purge fled to rural areas, establishing base areas in remote provinces like Jiangxi. There, they began experimenting with land reform and peasant mobilization, building a revolutionary movement that drew its strength from China's impoverished countryside rather than its industrial cities. Mao Zedong, a relatively junior communist leader in 1927, emerged as the dominant figure in this rural strategy. The civil war between nationalists and communists, briefly interrupted by Japanese invasion, would continue until 1949. Meanwhile, Chiang's unification of China was more nominal than real. Former warlords who had joined the nationalist government retained their armies and regional power bases. They accepted Chiang's authority when it suited them and ignored it when it didn't. The Central Plains War of 1930 saw several major warlords rebel against Chiang, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops in a conflict that dwarfed many international wars. Chiang won, but only by making deals with other warlords, granting them continued autonomy in exchange for nominal loyalty. Economically, the nationalist government never established the developmental state that China desperately needed. Military spending consumed 40 to 50% of the national budget. Resources that should have gone to education, infrastructure, and industrialization instead went to maintaining armies and fighting internal enemies. The Nanjing decade, from 1928 to 1937, saw some modernization in areas under direct nationalist control, but China remained fragmented, weak, and vulnerable. That vulnerability became catastrophic in 1937, when Japan launched a full-scale invasion. The Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing in July 1937 was a minor skirmish, but it triggered a war that had been building for decades. Japanese forces, disciplined and coordinated, swept through northern China. Chinese armies, still divided by regional loyalties and conflicting commands, put up fierce resistance in places, but couldn't mount an effective coordinated defense. The fall of Nanjing in December 1937 and the massacre that followed revealed the consequences of Warlord Era fragmentation. Chinese troops defending the capital came from multiple army groups with poor coordination. When Japanese forces broke through, the defense collapsed into chaos. What followed was one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Japanese troops spent 6 weeks systematically murdering civilians, raping women, and destroying property.